Hi everybody and welcome to Chapter 6 of Leroy Ninker Saddles Up. This week we are going to be focusing on the letter I, and I can make a lot of different sounds. So I just want to focus today on when I says the sound I. And there are a couple pretty common situations where I is usually going to make that long I sound. It's going to say its own name. So I've highlighted a couple places on each page where I is making the I sound. And I'm hoping that we can start to see a pattern where I says I instead of saying I. Okay? So, last week in Chapter 5 of Leroy Ninker Saddles Up, Leroy and Maybelline went back to his apartment, but Maybelline doesn't fit inside his apartment. She won't make it through the door. So Leroy fed her a bunch of spaghetti, and then they fell asleep outside of his apartment. So, let's get started and see what happens. Chapter 6. Leroy Ninker dreamed that he was riding Maybelline on the open plain. So here, I don't know if we talked about this, but when we have an ing, this word is really the word ride, R-I-D-E. But in order to make it not look weird, we took the E away when we added the ing, because otherwise it would look like this. And that's kind of weird, right? So the word ride, this is actually a magic E word, but we took off the E in order to put the ing on. So when we have a magic E word, remember that means the E, we also call it a bossy E, the E hops over here and says, say your name. And then instead of saying rid, it says ride. Okay? So when we have a magic E word, the I is going to say its own name. It's going to say I. Or if we have a word that ends in this ing, that's another clue that the vowel is going to be a long vowel. It's going to say its name. Okay, let's see if we can find some other places. In the distance, there were purple mountains, and high up in the sky, there was a daytime moon. So we've got two here. This is another pretty common one, this IGH. So whenever you see this IGH in a word, that is going to say I. So you don't have to say all of the sounds. It's like the G and the H aren't even there. You can pretend they don't exist. And then it's just the word, it's just the sound I. So it just says hi. And then we saw daytime. So daytime is another magic E word. So the E hops over to the I and says, say your name. So instead of saying day-tim, it says daytime. Okay? I'm going to reread that sentence. In the distance, there were purple mountains, and high up in the sky, there was a daytime moon. The moon was looking down at Leroy and Maybelline, and it was smiling at them. So again, what we did here, this is a magic E word, but because we added the ing, we took the E off of the word smile. So we had the word smile, and we added ing, but it looks real weird, so we took the E off. Okay? So this would be a magic E word. The E hops over and says, say your name. But we can also think of sometimes the ing is sort of acting like a magic E here. In Leroy's dream, Maybelline was running very fast. Also, she had a full set of teeth. It's just like a movie, thought Leroy. We are just like magic E word. The E hops over and says, say your name. We are just like a horse and cowboy in a movie. This is not a magic E word because there needs to be a consonant in between the E and the I. So even though there's IE together, this is not magic E because there has to be another letter in between them. The wind rushed across his face. It smelled like cinnamon and clover and spaghetti sauce. The wind is promising me wonderful things, thought Leroy. And then he thought, Patty Lamarck is right. There's that IGH. Right. I am very good at speaking poeticals. Maybelline's hooves pounded on the earth. Maybelline's hooves were extremely loud. Leroy had never heard such loud hooves, even in the movies. Maybelline's hooves were as loud as thunder. The cinnamon and clover and spaghetti sauce scented wind blew harder and faster. It tickled Leroy's nostrils, and then it slapped him on the cheeks. The wind, obviously, was trying to tell Leroy something important. And then, in his dream, Leroy heard Patty Lamarck's voice. "Wake up, Hank!" she shouted. "Protect your horse!" Leroy Ninker woke up. Thunder crashed. A bolt of lightning lit up the world. "Dad blibber it!" said Leroy. "It's fixin' to rain." He stood. He hitched up his pants and pushed his hat down on his head. He looked at Maybelline. Her eyes were closed. She was still asleep. "Horse of my heart," whispered Leroy, "sweetest and most delicate of all springtime blossoms, I cannot let you be rained on. I will go inside," that's a magic E-word, "and get you an umbrella." Maybelline's eyes stayed closed. "I'll be right back." This is a contraction which we talked about in phonics. It says I will, so we still say I'll because it's the word I. "I'll be right back," said Leroy. He turned and ran into Unit 12. When Leroy was gone, the rain began. A drop fell on Maybelline's nose. Another drop fell on her ear. The horse woke up. She lifted her head and looked around her. Terrible things were happening. Thunder was crashing. Lightning was flashing. And worst of all, Maybelline was utterly, absolutely alone. And she was not the kind of horse who liked to be alone. We've talked about liked. That's a magic E word. The E hops over and says, say its name. But kind, there's really no clues here that it should be a long I. So with a word like kind, where you don't see a magic E or you don't see this IGH, then you should try both. So as I'm reading and I get to this word kind, I'm looking and I don't see any clues to whether it's a long I or a short I. So I try both. So she was not the kind of horse, or she was not the kind of horse. So I try both, and then I decide which one makes more sense. Kind isn't really a word that I know, but kind is a word I know. So that's the one I'm going to go with. She was not the kind of horse who liked to be alone. Maybelline let out a long, questioning whinny. The thunder crashed. The lightning flashed. Maybelline called out again. So there's that IGH part, lightning. Where was the little man? Where was the little man with the big hat and the beautiful words? Where was the little man who brought her spaghetti? Maybelline called out again and again. There was no answer. She didn't know what to do, and when Maybelline didn't know what to do, what Maybelline did was run. Leroy Ninker came out of Unit 12 holding an umbrella up high over his head. "Here I am, my springtime blossom." There's that magic E. The E is telling the I to say its name. "Time blossom," he said, "and I have brought you an umbrella." But when he got to where Maybelline should be, there was no Maybelline there. "Maybelline," said Leroy into the darkness and the wind and the rain. "Maybelline." The wind blew harder. "Horse of my heart," said Leroy Ninker. The rain came down hard and fast. The lightning flashed, revealing a horseless world. Leroy stared into the emptiness. He heard Patty Lamarck's voice in his head, in the wind. She was saying, "Do not leave Maybelline alone for too long, or you will live to rue and regret the day." A great gust of wind came along and grabbed hold of Leroy's umbrella and ripped it right out of his hands. Right out of his hands. Leroy watched as the umbrella spun up and into the darkness. He was a cowboy without a horse, a cowboy without an umbrella. He was a cowboy, absolutely, utterly alone. Well, that was a very sad ending for this chapter. I really want to read next chapter and see what happens, but what I want you guys to focus on for your decoding strategy this week is we learned about IGH, which says I, and we learned that a magic E can also make the I say its name. So the magic E is when there's an I, and then there's another letter, and then there's an E, and the E hops over the other letter and says, "Say your name." And so then the I says I instead of I. But if you don't see either of these clues, then try both sounds. So remember we read the word kind, but there aren't either of those clues in the word kind. It's not a magic E word and we don't see the IGH. So if you see a word like this, You just have to try both. K-ind or k-ind. Okay, you have to try both. Same thing here. I have this word. There aren't any clues here, so I have to try both. Is it w-ind or w-ind? You have to decide. Okay, so when we've got I sounds, you can look for these clues, the IGH and the magic E, or sometimes you might just have to try both sounds. All right, guys, as you're reading this week, look out for those tricky I's and keep going.